Hello and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another Historical Humans Reacts. And on today's episode, we have the most rage-baity article that we could potentially find, and we plan on going at it because this author is talking about how replacing the Elgin marbles just leaves us with fancy fakes, and this comes as calls to repatriate the Elgin marbles from the British Museum in the UK back to their rightful home of the Parthenon in Athens, Greece,
Yep.
has started gaining some level of steam and is actually a very good thought experiment and a great conversation to have because it is one of the most blatant examples of stolen goods, which, for the record, the British claim that they have rightful possession of because they paid someone for them, but they paid an outsider who went in and took them and removed them.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sort of like buying the Brooklyn Bridge from a guy you met on the street in New York. You do not own the Brooklyn Bridge. You just got ripped off.
But the difference is the British had the manpower and the weaponry to challenge anyone who had a differing opinion.
Yeah, they physically took the Brooklyn Bridge home, which is impressive in its own right. But anyway, the argument specifically in this article comes from a compromise that was proposed because the British Museum has long had this massive gallery dedicated to these marbles. Almost as soon as they got them, they knew what they were, they knew their significance, and they displayed them in as grand a way as they could. This compromise is basically Greece receives the originals back into its care. They're repatriated to their home country, and the British can continue to have and display plaster mold replicas of them. Now, plaster molds have long been used in museums for displaying artifacts that are fragile, easily damaged, or extremely heavy, and thus would be in danger of collapse in the floor or have other structural issues. The most common example of this is every dinosaur bone you have ever seen. I'm sorry, kids. Those aren't the real ones. The real ones are so heavy they would tear the ceiling out if they were attached to it.
Don't break the immersion because, as Mr. Abulafia makes the argument of, it is an important thing to look at the original object when visiting a museum. You are deceiving the masses if you are using plaster molds in their stead. And he does pose an interesting, albeit I think wrongly guided argument where and it's funny because we learned about this in a museum studies course that we actually took. But in an AI world, one could imagine dozens of clones of the British or Louvre scattered across the globe. And there is no doubt they could educate in some regard, but are modern reproductions what people want to see? And this, where it has some validity, is there are talks about a digital museum, what that would actually look like, how you could actually go about displaying it, and there's a few different interesting arguments and typologies that have been discussed. One of which is like a 3D reproduction where using VR headsets, you could walk around and, in theory, get to visit the museum without ever having to step foot in it. And that is a valid potential avenue for the future that is discussed. I mean, one of the most promising and prevalent examples of this, believe it or not, is actually the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Because what people may not necessarily realize or understand is one of the reasons we are able to reproduce and rebuild it after the fire, and Cullum, I don't know if you knew this, is they did thousands of 3D scans of the cathedral for an Assassin's Creed game.
Yep. Yeah, Assassin's Creed in Paris really made sure that there was an exact to the millimeter data collection of that structure. Now, unfortunately, it is French, and thus the British will never do anything like it.
Well, and there is a counter argument about funding, having people pay admissions, having the stuff be displayed in true earnest. But as time goes on, as we start aging and start developing as societies, we understand that a lot of items that are in museums were not ethically sourced. They were stolen, they were coerced, they were downright just bought from parties that didn't have the culture's interests in mind. You know,
Yeah.
and the Elgin Marbles are a great example of this, of someone who didn't care about the history, just selling it for a quick dollar, when in reality, the entirety of the Greek government, the Greek people, this is their magnus opus. This is what they want back, because when you visit Athens, you go to the Parthenon, you go to the temples, and you see the stark emptiness of where these used to be. You are pulling an entire heartbeat out of a culture by not having this there.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah. And with, with all that said, there is honestly a little bit of an argument to the difference between seeing a replica and seeing the original. And sure, the original is more impactful, but the argument in the end doesn't hold water, because if a replica is a true and exact replica, then it shares in the beauty of the thing. Like, the best example I have is a personal one. I There's a little museum in southern Illinois called the Spurlock Museum, and they have up there one of the only sets of plaster replicas of the metopes of the Parthenon, which are these little panels that people put inside the Parthenon, these little stone panels depicting mythological events and battles and processions. And there was a plaster replica. I loved looking at them when I was there. I was a little disappointed when I realized that they were just replicas and that the originals were, you know, nowhere to be found, i.e., they're back in Greece under a lot of protection, I do believe. But like there's that little bit of disappointment. Oh, I didn't get to see the original. There's that little bit of allure, but at the same time, I got to see something I would never have otherwise seen, and that had more value than this. There can only be one. It must be the original argument. Like, the replicas had almost as much value as the original for the purposes of museums.
Well, and this guy, this article's author, has almost invariably just counter himself, because one of the things he talked about was how important it is to get to see an item that an emperor may have held or a pharaoh may have used, and there is some validity in that. But then he also talks about Cambridge University, where their Museum of Classical Archaeology is entirely consisted of plaster casts, and that it is a great thing to get to see, but that most people would instead head for the Fitzwilliam Museum to go to real things. And the part that I hate is he's talking about why should the British Museum devote a gallery costing millions to expensive forgeries that try to create the illusion of the originals. But one of the things that I think is so very important that this dude has no idea about is there are so many great things out there that are so volatile that may just fall apart at any point, that having a plaster cast of them may be the only way we can safely actually display them. And an example of this that he talks about is the Italian archives of Renaissance princes that he got to read and touch. And paper specifically will fall apart with the wrong breath. It's not meant to have a stable shelf life of eternity. I mean, the Elgin marbles specifically are a different argument because they're made out of exactly that, marble. But when you look at other objects, things made out of organic compounds, clothing, cloth, leathers, papers, all of those things will eventually decay, and museums do a great job of stabilizing, but they cannot prevent, and that is something that people don't understand. And when you talk about having an entire museum dedicated to fakes, realistically, there is no discernible difference to those who are looking at it. If you are able to look at an object that has been one for one reproduced, whether it be an arrowhead, a spear, a sword, you will not be able to discern a difference. You,
Yeah.
as a human with the naked eye, are unable to tell a difference. Um,
Because
maybe
there's two, yeah, because there's two parts to the museums. There's the preservation and the archive, which is where all the originals go to ensure that they are not destroyed by time or that time has a minimal effect on them. Then there is the museum exhibition itself, where you are displaying what should be prime and eye catching instances of these cultural artifacts, these things. And the best versions of those are the ones we reproduce and recreate. Most things in most museums that are on display are exact, painstaking reproductions of the originals because cloth is destroyed by sunlight and even just light in general. So if you want to physically view this ancient cloth, you will have destroyed it within weeks. And that is not something any museum is willing to do.
it's also why
So,
most museums, when they do show off actual legitimate examples, they are adamant that there is no flash photography, and in some places, no photography at all. When I was in Dublin just a few weeks ago, I went and saw the Book of Kells, a 700-year-old book that you cannot even pull your phone out in the gallery
oh
because
yeah,
they are so afraid of light affecting and impacting the book.
oh yeah, yeah. I was in a museum in Athens, and at one point, I got yelled at for being on my phone because they are worried that the light from my phone, just turning it on, would hurt the pigments on some of the pottery that was in situ and had been sitting there since at least 2,300 years ago.
The ridiculous thing in my mind, and part of where I think this author loses a lot of his credibility, because as much as I would like to use harsh language to describe this guy, you got to give him some leeway. But part of where I think he loses a lot of his credence and credibility is he talks about how important the marbles are to begin with, but then also talks about how much of a cultural heritage item they are, that they're a part of the common heritage of humanity, and that the public knows there's no substitute for the real thing, but then offers, and in his own language, in his own verbiage, much better would be to offer the bogus marbles to Athens, to the place that they come from, to the place that they originate, to their actual home. He
Yeah,
thinks
yeah.
that the British hold a better, more virtuous soapbox that should be
Well,
displayed.
his argument is replicas are worthless and are an insult to the cultural heritage of humanity. Therefore, let all other countries have replicas.
Including the ones where they originate from, which is the most
Yeah,
absurd thought process. Like
yeah.
the
By
amount
other, he means non-British. We mean not, yeah, the non-British
the
countries.
amount of self-importance, the amount of self-righteousness here. Like in the
Yeah, this
field, we
is
talk about this
this is
idea,
bad.
and this might alienate some people who might be watching, and I apologize, but
Here
a
we go.
lot of this centers around what we like to refer to as white saviorism. And this is an
Um,
idea that began and perpetuated in earnest during the Victorian period, specifically among the British, where their idea was that you needed to basically basically try to save these cultures, save these other nations, save these other items, and that would go from antiquities to goods to even just cultures themselves. I mean, this idea was so prominent, it permeated into American culture as well, where we followed a policy and process of kill the Indian, save the man, which was to eliminate and strip them of their own culture to try and save them. This goes as far as to their grave goods, and we still see a lot of that with our own collections, with our own goods, where things were excavated from tribal lands that are still in institutions, and we refuse to give them back because they don't have a proper home or a place to house them. The Elgin marbles are completely the opposite, where they do have a place to go. The Greeks spent millions building a state of the art facility that vastly surpasses that of the British Museum, and yet the British Museum still claims that they are the rightful
Yep.
home for these marbles, even though
Yeah.
their facilities lack in comparison to the Greeks.
Yeah, as someone who has been inside both institutions, the Acropolis Museum of Athens and the British Museum of London, um, the Acropolis Museum is very state of the art. It is very secure. Its ceiling is not leaking on its artifacts. There is not multiple was it galleries that constantly have to be closed and reopened because the things in them were damaged by the weather.
Or, having a curator steal over 2,000 artifacts and sell them on eBay.
Yeah. Yeah, so like there's a lot going on here and a lot to unpack, and just replicas don't really diminish the value of the originals. They are not, and they are themselves not less valuable than the original for the purposes of museum exhibition. Sure, you can argue that replicas are less valuable in terms of the preservation that we would put on it and for keeping things in archive, but for display purposes, yes, replicas, one-to-one replicas are very much a good way to go, whether they're plaster replicas, whether they're created, exact reproductions using traditional methods, which is a thing people do for museums all the time. Replicas are useful. They are the staple of museum exhibitions.
At the end of the day, and this I think will be my final arguing point, is museums are institutions for education, for the purposes of educating. And for the purposes of educating, a plaster mold or even a laser etched reproduction, as he mentioned in the beginning of the article, you can still have that value, that educational value. What he's arguing on here is the emotional connection. And I think that is one of the most absurd things to try and argue, is that you should have cultural heritage and responsibility of management over a different culture because you think your museum will have it better, or because you'll be upset that you can't see the originals. Well, here's where a lot of these countries are really starting to make this argument, is come to our country to see the originals.
Yep.
Greeks, so many Brits go to Greece to have vacation, to go on holiday, to make that extra step to go to Athens if they truly wanted to see the originals should not be that much of an argument, should not be that much of a fight. At this point, it is because of this collectorism, this fetishization of wanting the originals, I think is just absurd. Like, a lot of other institutions as well have traveling exhibitions. I got to see the traveling Pompeii exhibition where they had actual, you wouldn't believe it, they had plaster molds that came from Pompeii. Still
Yeah.
didn't diminish the value of the exhibition, didn't take away from it.
Yeah. 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 The general thing here, the point to just leave off is you do not need to see Teddy Roosevelt's corpse to understand Teddy Roosevelt and to be impressed upon with the part of history that he was. And that is true of everything. I'm just going to use that example right there. And I think we should probably wrap it up at this point, Justin.
Yeah, this has gone twice as long as any of our
Yeah.
others. But let us know what your thoughts
Take it.
are. Contribute to this argument, and we might even do a follow-up if people want us to. Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, let us know, and we will see you in the next one.